friends. I am Adelina, and I'm excited to welcome you back to another episode of Life with God. It's Tuesday evening, and that means we get to continue the discussion on what it means to live a life with God, and especially in this season, focusing on the topic of love, how God is love, and how we can, how the way He is love models our concept and our behavior of loving beings. Um, Tonight we have an interesting discussion. We're going to have an interesting discussion with a psychologist, a counseling psychologist, and of course our group of students who will be helping with the discussion. But before we go into that, I would like to share a few things from the first two episodes because they're going to help as a springboard to our conversation this evening. So, in the first episode, we had Dr. Oliver Glantz share with us about meaning and meaninglessness. And one key aspect that we learned in that first program is that meaning derives from relationships. One of the viewers of that episode captured the essence of that discussion in the following words. My take on meaning is that we're created for relationship, and we find meaning in relationships with God and with others. This is Emmanuel Millen. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for sharing with us your feedback, for following the conversation, and for engaging with the concept and the topic. So I guess we could say then that relationships are the birthplace of meaning. That is one key concept that we learned with Dr. Oliver Glantz. And in terms of God as being our model, one interesting picture of God that he drew for us is that God is a father who is there for us. Contrary to how patriarchal societies of the time were seeing the relationship between the father and the son, where the son was there for the father, God shows himself in the Bible and in relationship with us as a father who is there for us. In other words, he exists for us. And Arlene Drew, another one of our viewers of that first episode, shared some really very eloquent insight on this particular concept in the following words. Oliver presents that Yahweh means I'm there for you. This coincides with the chiastic structure of the test between two fathers in the sacrifice of Isaac, where the exact center is Abraham's response to Isaac. Here I am, my son. She continues that switch from patriarchal, you are there for me, for the benefit of the clan, to God's fatherhood, I am there for you, is so biblically amazing. Amen and amen and amen, says Arlene. Thank you so much, Arlene. She is a recent PhD graduate, completed her PhD with a dissertation on the sacrifice of Isaac. So you see how she's connecting already the picture of God as Yahweh, as I'm here for you, with the particular story of Isaac in Abraham. And we already see in Abraham the change that God models for him, the transformation from the son being there for him to him as a father becoming like God in the sense of being there for Isaac. And that is the kind of transformation we're looking for in this program for our relationships. In episode 2, we continue the conversation, zooming in on the concept of love with Dr. John Reeve. He's a professor of church history at Andrews, and he discussed with us about he shared with us some specific aspects about early Christianity and how the first Christians understood God as love. Interestingly, I think that was a surprise for some of us, definitely for me. The early Christians did not use terminology of love. They saw God more so as benevolent than loving, and that is partly due to having to defend themselves against misconceptions about their practices, but that also derives from the highly influential Greek philosophy in early Christianity, where due to their view of reality and as God as being the divinity of Greek philosophy being transcendent and completely unchanging and detached and distant, that view of God was transferred to some extent in Christianity, which also accounts for a lack of the picture of God as loving, if you want, as personal, up close, and involved. And so again, from early Christianity, we learned that the first Christians saw God more so as a distant, a detached God, which is to some extent we could honestly say an unbiblical portrait of God and the God human relationship. We also discussed with Dr. Reeve about the fact that the most powerful evidence of God being a personal God is a transformation that we experience. So God is transforming us and He's forming us. And here I'd like to bridge to the conversation we're going to have this evening with our psychologist, um, looking at how now, we learned how the first Christians were influenced by their surrounding culture, by the factors that were part of their formative stage. And now we're going to bring this um, conversation into our personal lives. We're going to come close to our time, to our individual context, and look at how our early relationships as human beings born into this world, our early relationships with our parents, with our caregivers, with the figures of authority, how they shape our view of God and our view of love. And there is a parallel between, if you want, between early Christianity being born in the midst of a context and us as human beings being born in a context, and that context influencing us with beneficial ways, but also in detrimental ways. So we have a big discussion ahead of us, and I'm really excited to get going. So I'd love to welcome Dr. Carole Woolford-Hunt. Welcome, Dr. Hunt. Thank you so much for taking time from your very busy day to share some of your wisdom and expertise with us.
Oh,
And
thank you for having me.
my pleasure. And we also have a great discussion group. Tonight, we're joined by Ruth, Kian, Mark, and Nicola. Welcome, guys. Thank you for also taking from your time to be part of this discussion. Before we delve into the topic, as usual, we are going to take a few minutes to get to know our guests. And so we have a set of questions prepared, and we're excited to see how much we can get to know about Dr. Hunt. Um, okay, are we ready? All right. Where were you born?
I was born in London, England.
What is your favorite prayer practice?
I think prayer practice. I have a prayer group that I belong to, and we meet every Sabbath morning early before, church activities. And it has come to be a very special time for me because it's with a group of women, um, and we're close. And so that has served spiritual support for me, but also social support too.
What was your favorite childhood game?
Game. I was actually quite a sports aficionado, which my kids laugh at now. They couldn't imagine me. I used to be playing field hockey and um, a, a game called netball, which is the precursor to basketball, um, and a game named Rounders, which is a precursor to the American baseball. It makes me sound like I'm from 1603, but many of the things that America right now are things that were developed obviously from British standards. So yes, some of those games were games that I was very involved in and active in.
Can you remember the first book that you ever read through?
First book. Hmm. I think it would have been a I don't remember exactly, but when I think back to the books I liked when I was really young,
Mm.
um, I think I really enjoyed books that were, when I was very young, Thomas the Tank Engine,
Yes.
and the whole train situation and train spotting. I thought was really, really cool. And then as I got older, like middle elementary school, and then early, what you would call junior high, I was really into Gerald Durrell books.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you guys know that.
Yes.
They wrote a series of books about this family on the island of Corfu, and I just loved them. I couldn't get enough of those.
So
How do you distress?
Um, I actually de-stress through connection. Some people like to retreat to private spaces and alone spaces to de-stress. I like to immerse myself in family and friends. I'm known as the group facilitator. I'm always like, let's get together, because I feel very calm and I do distress in those kinds of settings. Um, Besides that, I also like to exercise, because that's also distressing, but I prefer to exercise with others rather than exercising. Um, and Yeah, those are the things that I think are the best. Watching movies and TV and stuff, not so much now, because I'm having to spend so much time on Zoom that de-stressing is leaving the computer, leaving the screen. So I am right now.
What is a memorable place from your travels?
Um, hmm. That's funny. One of the things that is valuable to me, it's one of the things that I've been blessed to do, is to do quite a bit of traveling. And so one of my hobbies is to travel, once again, with family and or friends, and see how many places, new places we can go. My family, I have two kids, a son and a daughter, and then my husband. And so we have traveled with extended family, etc., to some places that are quite memorable. One of them that we went to a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, was to Dubai in the Arab Emirates. That was fantastic. And being in the deserts of Dubai, it was just something that was totally outside of my experience framework. And then we went, either, I think it was the year after that, we went to Iceland. And so it was a real juxtaposition between the deserts of Dubai and the frozen tundra of Iceland. Um, and it really brought us back to the amazing creative abilities that God has, because it's one earth, but when you get to travel around, you get to see how it's so different in these different spaces, and it creates different environments and different framing for human beings. So you see how people are different and why they're different, because it's so different where we go around the world. There are lots of differences, um, as well as similarities. But those, travel is a big thing for me. I love it, and those are two places that we've been to that we were really struck by the natural beauty of the setting.
Awesome. I got to visit Iceland a couple years ago, and it was absolutely beautiful. It's definitely on my to-do list again, although there are so many new places that you can visit that it's hard to go back to the same. But Dr. Woolford-Hunt, so not only you have expertise in psychology, counseling psychology, but also you've witnessed many of these cultures in your travels, and so you're able to share with us from your research and but also from your experience of understanding different cultures from up close. And so as we transition into the discussion tonight, as I mentioned earlier on, one thing that I would like us to focus on is family context, early development, early childhood development, because that is so critical to the way we're formed. Just as early Christians were formed in a context, every human being is born in a context. And that stays with us for life in many ways. And of course, as adults, we get to choose some of the patterns that we've inherited, whether we want to keep them and perpetuate them or change them. That is a big topic in itself. But let's begin the conversation with these two premises that family is a first relationship where we learn love, because that is a topic we're studying, love, right? That is where we first, family-like structures, caregiving settings um, as vulnerable human beings. And that these caregivers are figures of authority. So in a sense, they are the first picture of God that we learn. So in starting from this point, the big question that I would have to begin to open the conversation is, what are some harmful mentalities and behaviors that parents or caregivers can adopt that implant in us an unhealthy picture of love, and as a result of that damage our relational development, since love takes place in relationship? And conversely, and we may move back and forth in the conversation, we may take them one at a time. And conversely, what are some of the healthful, the good mentalities and behaviors that our caregivers can adopt that give us a healthy picture of love and they enhance our relational development? And along with the research and the ideas, I really hope we can hear also some examples, because oftentimes when people learn bad behaviors, our first tendency is to say, "Oh, that's not me. You know, that hasn't happened to me, or I wouldn't do that." But in hearing examples, I think it's easier for us to have that mirror before us and be able to be confronted with some of the things that we may need to change ourselves. What can you share with us about these questions?
Well, that is a course. And so, being a professor first and foremost, I laugh when you ask this question and assume that it can be answered in one, half of a class. I just told you I finished a class and I teach graduate at the graduate level only, and so my classes are a minimum of 3 hours. So I will try and refine my ideas and my thoughts and my statements to fit into what would be considered less than half of a class with regards to timing. When I think about relationships, and I do all the time as a psychologist, training people to be psychologists, it's all about relationships. And I think about it within a psychological context um, and a religious context. Relationships are what makes us who we are. We were born in relationship, we were conceived in relationship, and we have this continual relationship with God. And so, this idea of being good at relationships or not good at relationships, or focused or not focused, is a bit of a misnomer, because we are constantly in relationship, whether we want to be or not. It's just whether we're conscious about it and how we manage it. So when I think about the way that our knowledge about relationships is imparted to us, it's very much in keeping with what God did from a religious and Adventist perspective. When God wanted us to know about relationship, God sent God's essence here in the form of Jesus to be here with us, to be in relationship, because relationship is best taught through relationship. You can read as much as you like about stuff, but it's not the same as when you're in the relationship. And so I think that um, we've got the religious perspective that says, Jesus came here to be in relationship with us, so we will know what that means. And from a psychological perspective, we do understand people as being born in a relationship context. You're born, everybody has a mother and is born into this world and is born into a family context. And that context really creates the capacity and the framework for relationship. And we have a lot of research that supports um, the fact that this is very framing. So when attachment, and if you look at Winnicottian attachment theory, if attachments are not formed and adaptive attachments are not formed in the early times of your life with your mother, as early as from birth to 1 or 2, then it really has an impact on your ability to form attachments later on. And there's research that shows that people who have poor attachments in childhood um, end up having relational attachment issues as they get into adulthood and go into long-term relationships. So we know that that's the case. with regards to parenting, and how parents support us in developing these attachment styles or these relationships, there's been a significant amount of research that looks at attachment styles, which I know you all would have heard about. So parenting, I mean, not attachment styles, parenting styles. So you would have heard of the authoritarian parent versus the authoritative parent versus the completely uninvolved parent or the permissive parent. And all of these styles have impact on how a person then conducts their relationships. But what's even more interesting is that not only does it have impact on how we form relationships with each other, but research is showing and has shown that it has impact on how we create our God image, how we understand God and how we relate with God is very connected to how we were parented. If we were parented by an authoritative person versus authoritarian versus uninvolved or versus permissive. So all of this just, I suppose, highlights the significance of early childhood environments and how it can have lifelong, and sometimes eternal impact on your ability to make those connections and be in relationship with God. So to give examples, I mean, I'm sure that people in the group have had experiences. You can think about your own parenting, the way you were parented by your parents, and work out if it's authoritarian, it's, you know, quite strict, rigid. There's punishment. It's autocratic. There's a lot of structure in it, and that's what's seen as the main way or the main way of being. And so you have to create a relationship within that context. Versus authoritative, it's got standards for sure, but it's more flexible. It's enabling. You've got some guidelines. You've got the ability to do some self-regulation. There's more democratic aspects to it. So authoritative is seen as being more helpful in people creating relationships that include love, because the authoritarian perspective really doesn't stress the love side of a relationship. That's kind of cut off. But the authoritative it gives you structure, but also gives you the opportunity to deal with the love side. The uninvolved, obviously, that is not helpful because it's just distant, and the person doesn't develop the skills to connect because the parent really hasn't been involved in their lives. And then the permissive, where they're given everything and there's no structure, there's no boundaries, there are no limits, also does not help people develop the most healthy relationships in the future. So when you think about all of those things, I would be interested to find out if people have noticed some parallels between either their experience or experiences of their friends with these kind of parenting styles and the kind of relationships they have with God or their way of managing their spiritual life, and seeing any connections.
I mean, as you were talking, I was definitely seeing some parallels with, you know, growing up and the way that my parents were and the way that I relate with God now. I know that, you know, one thing that always kind of struck me as different between like myself and my friends is, you know, I'd hear my friends' parents tell them to do something and they'd like talk back or fight, and the parent would just go do it, you know, and I was always like, that surprised me because in my house, you know, my parents would tell me to do something, and if I didn't understand, I would ask why. Like I was confused. And I remember most of the time growing up, unless it was like an emergency situation, my parents weren't upset with me for asking why. Like they didn't say, "Oh, you're being disrespectful," and they'd actually, as much as possible for my little brain, help me understand. Well, this is why. And so by the time I hit like the rebellious age, I had already figured out my parents knew what they were talking about. And so like, but that has translated into my relationship with God, where when I'm reading the scripture or praying or hearing a sermon and I'm confused about something, I have no problem asking why. and thinking about it and talking to God about it and going and finding professors who know more than me and grilling them and saying, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, I'm not uncomfortable with doing questions. But then also there's kind of this sense of like when I don't totally understand something, but I feel God calling me to something, I can kind of rest in that because I'm like, oh, he's shown me, he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, that's such a good example of the connection that is, and sometimes it's very clear for people, like it's clear for you, but for others, they haven't made the connection. I think it's really important. I have a friend who, it's quite funny because they're married, so it's two friends, and one grew up in, I would say, an authoritative environment where there were rules for sure, but there was this stress on self-determination and assertiveness, and so they were able to develop both sides. And so their construct of God, or their God image right now, is really that God is a loving God, and there's little that they could do right now that would make God not love them. And that there are rules and there are things that they have to try and do, but they do that to the best and they're fine. Their partner, on the other hand, grew up in an uninvolved family background where the parents were very hands-off. One parent was absent and the other one just let them do anything. And then they got converted to Adventism and decided that they had to work out what their relationship with God was going to be. They didn't have a template to go by from childhood. And I knew that that permissive situation wasn't good. So they totally went the other way, and they're very, very exacting on themselves now. It's a lot of rule-based, law-based stuff and focus rather than love focus. And so you can see it happen in many ways as people kind of navigate how they're going to relate with God at this time.
There is an interesting kind of short case study that I will always remember reading in a psychology book about a man who was holding on to alcohol as a habit because drinking alcohol with his father was the only way he bonded with his father. And his father now had been deceased. And so he was holding on to that habit just because it reminded him of that bond and their relationship. And it just made me realize how people can develop attachment to unhealthy habits just because of the connection and the bond with the loving figure of love, however messed up that love was. And I'm curious because you mentioned some of these family patterns here that can create a defective picture of love in us. I'm curious, how do we detach as we grow into adulthood and we start raising these questions and we read stuff and we learn about ourselves and our context? How do we detach from a bad pattern or unhealthy pattern or habit or concept of love without losing the relationship? Because sometimes it's just easier to hold on to the pattern because you feel like you're giving up the relationship with the pattern, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Before we go to there, though, I saw Ruth was about to say something, so I want to give you the opportunity to jump in.
Oh, I had a question and I'm not sure if it will change the topic. Should I just say it anyways? It's
Yeah,
related.
please.
Okay, my question is because we see that different people have slightly different relationships with God or images of God that have been shaped by, you know, their family and by growing up. What do we say as believers to people who may think if your images of God are different and they're based on your family, like how can you prove that God isn't just something that you're making up?
Right. Well, I don't know that this is proof that God is being made up or not being made up, but I know that from a psychology standpoint, really, everything is a construct. And I know from a theology standpoint, that's not the same. So I'm putting it out there from a psychology standpoint. Everything is constructed in the brain and in the psyche that you have. And the perspective is that the experiences that you have shape your brain, and then your brain then creates the construct of whatever it is. So if we move God out of the picture for a minute and we just focus on color, something is supposedly red or it's green or it's blue, but everybody sees that color quite differently. If you go back to the science of the color doesn't even exist, but it's a construct of our minds that puts color on a world that's really just, gray and white. So this idea that we're constructing as we go, and our constructs are based and framed by our experiences from a psychological standpoint, is just a general thing that people understand and believe. The impact of God in this, I mean, I would leave it to the theologians, that God is bigger than all of these things, these confines that we deal with within our disciplines. And so God can work above and beyond that. But the tangible, physical body that we have to deal with, the brain, the limits of our brain, our eyes, our senses, all of those create a space that we have to work within, because we're not divine. That's the space that we get to work in. And some people, because of whether or not you construct or understand or can relate with God in a way or not, is a different question to whether God exists. You see what I'm saying? Whether God exists or not, that's a different question. How you can understand God is very individual, and it's based what you come into this world with. If you come in with Down syndrome and you have limited intellectual or cognitive capacity, I would suggest that your construct of God would be different than if you come in and you have normative cognitive abilities and you have experiences that give you or you have the skills that will allow you to understand God in a different way. If you come in and you're blind, the way that you understand God won't be necessarily through your sight because you don't have it, but it will be through enhanced hearing or enhanced sense of touch. So how we understand God, how we connect with God, how we relate with God, that's all very much in keeping with our experiences and our physical capacities. Whether God exists or not, that's a question for the theology and seminary to deal with. I'll defer to them.
Can I jump in real quick on this? Because I mean, I love what you were saying right there. And it makes me think, like you were saying, like, you said from a psychology standpoint, everything is a construct. I know theology doesn't like that, but I mean, even from a theology standpoint, if we're talking about God, if I could prove it to somebody definitively, if I could show you, oh, well, this is how I know for certain that this is God, that belies the concept of faith. For faith, there has to be an element of unknown. That's you can't, that's why you trust. Faith implies trust and commitment in relational aspects, but you can't have complete and total trust and faith when there's not an element of I don't know, when there's not an element of I am not 100%, by scientific, evidence sure. And so, if someone were to come to me with that question, I'd be like, well, then where's the faith? And the other thing I would say is, how small would God need to be for all of us to have the same image of him? If all of us could come on an agreed image of God, he must be a very small God. If God is much bigger than us, then obviously we're all only going to have pieces of him, and that's why our images look different.
And I totally agree with that, that the concept of God is so, it expands so far beyond our ability to comprehend, to really understand, that it does take millions of people, billions of people to try and put their knowledge together. And even then, if we took everybody who's lived on the earth from the beginning of time to now, and we put all of their God constructs together, we still would only have this much knowledge of God if we understand God to be the kind of universal, all-knowing, or ever-present, omnipresent kind of entity that we know him to be.
I just have a question. From what I just heard from Nick and from what you had told us, is that then is there any right and wrong images? Because people who have grown up in an authoritative background or like authoritarian, I think I wasn't able to figure out those two, but in any way, like they might have a view of God in that way, but they feel love in that way, and they're like, I'm fine with that image of God. And because for them it's their childhood, and for them it's their way of understanding what is love. So like, can you ever go up to a person and like, oh, you have a completely wrong childhood, that was not how you were supposed to be educated, and so that's why you have a wrong view of God? And is it
that's a good question. And I always tell people that one of the things that I am so happy that I am not is God. And there's some things that God is responsible for doing. It's a God job. It's not my job. So one of the things I think that it's God's job to do is to work out who has the right motives and the pure heart, who is connected to God in the way that they need to be connected. I don't have to do that. And I am so happy. I don't have to judge anybody or work out what anybody else's situation is. All I can say is that when people come to, I would think, seminarians, or they come to a psychologist, they usually come with a thing that they're saying is a problem for them. And so then we can work on that problem. And if somebody is coming to a psychologist and saying that they have a problem with their relationships, and they feel that people are not, let's say they come from, as you described, an authoritarian background where there are rules and you listen to them, and this focus on love is not a big thing. You just, your love is through compliance. You just comply with the rules and behave. And they're in a relationship and their partner does not see it that way, then my job is to work with them on that relationship, and help them to navigate and develop the skills that they need to make their relationship work. Once they've done that, hopefully that development will then transfer into the way that they're understanding their relationship with God and what they're expecting God. If they're able to resolve these things in their earthly relationships and partnerships, then they won't think of God as being as punishing if that's what they felt God was before. They might think, well, God will forgive me because God loves me, whatever it is. So I think that our job is to work with people, as psychologists, is to work with people on their relational experiences between each other. And then as they develop those skills and work those things out, then they're able to then transfer that to the relationships they have with a higher power. The seminary, I would say the same thing, that the way to get to that would be more along the lines of helping them work out the relational issues, laws that they've learned. And then as they resolve those, and through relationship with you, because the therapist uses our relationship with the client to model adaptive behaviors. So usually when somebody comes to therapy, they don't know the therapist. And in the course of getting to know the therapist, in the course of getting to create a safe space where they can talk about their problems, in the course of being reinforced in that moment, when they do something that's loving, or when they're forgiving to themselves for something, and you say that is so amazing that you were able to forgive yourself. All of that then teaches the person to undo. The question before, Adelana, was, how do we undo it? In clinical settings, you can undo it in a therapeutic relationship, but it can be undone in other relationships where people have had healthier, more adaptive relationship backgrounds. And so when they are in relationship with somebody who hasn't, then their behavior will be a model, and that person can get confirmed in another way of being. Let's face it, everybody does what they know to do. And a lot of times people don't make the changes because they're scared. We're scared of the unknown. If I've only ever known one way of being, it's very frightening to think about being something totally different. And so relationships can often be a way to help people experiment and grow and learn how to be different in relationship. But all of this, I think, works together towards helping the person with their relationship with God.
Just a word of thank you for Kyun for bringing that into the conversation, because um, the truth is we're all broken, all of us, and I don't think it takes you need to be a Christian to recognize that. And none of our families is perfect. There's no perfect family. There's no perfect context where we grow up. And just as early Christianity developed in a context that had both very beneficial aspects and harmful aspects, the same thing is with us in any context. It's a good and evil mixed good. It's a mix of good and evil, right? This is our world, and I think the purpose of having these conversations and giving our mind permission to think about these issues is primarily for awareness of where we come from, what factors might have influenced us, because we will make choices in turn about any relationship we engage in, as as young adults, and then as parents, as we become that, and so on and so forth. And I think there is great power in being aware of things so that you can choose with more freedom, if you want, and not be a slave to the things that you've learned by habit. So that's just thank you, Kyun, for bringing that into the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Could I jump in really quick?
Oh, please.
I had a question. I'm curious if there is like an actual physical change that happens when that situation happens where you have your mind turned. I was recalling when you mentioned earlier about like how I was parented. I specifically remember one event later on in my childhood where I was invited to join a group doing something on Sabbath. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, that's obviously I am not going to be able to do that. And my parents came to me and they said, it's up to you. You can if you'd like, but you don't have to, but you can. We're not going to force you. It's up to you. And I was shocked. I came and said, no, I can't. That's the rule, right? I can't. No, it's up to you. And so I'm just curious, in those pivotal moments, and I'm sure we've all had those or have seen someone go through that. I'm just curious, is there an actual physical change from a psychology perspective, or is that something that's more abstract?
I think it's developmental, and relationships are progressive. So, I mean, everyone knows you're in a relationship and it's one way at the beginning and it may feel very different in the middle. And if there's an end, then it definitely feels different at the end than it did at the beginning. So things are things that grow and develop. And our understanding of the relationship also develops with time. So when I think about the situation you just described, I think many times people find themselves in a situation where the parents have said, this is the way it is, or not. But the parents have to give something out, whether they're being permissive or they're being authoritarian. They're still giving information out about the way things should be. And the child picks those up because those are things that are often nonverbal, but they are still very strong messages. Some of our strongest messages are nonverbal rather than the verbal. It's not what's being said, it's what's being done. And so the child picks that up and you go along, and then you get this situation where your parents were really kind of coming from a more authoritative perspective, where they gave you the rules and they gave you the structure, but they also gave you some opportunity for self-regulation and for assertiveness and and flexibility. And you were shocked. You were like, what? Wait a minute. That's not how it goes. You're meant to set the rules and I'm just meant to follow it, right? And I think that it was wonderful that your parents were able to do that for you, because in that moment, it gave you the autonomy to begin thinking independently about this. And it set you in a much better place to negotiate relationships later on, to negotiate relationship with God, in a way that you have a part to play. It's not just all about me telling you what to do. It's that you've got to be in this and you've got to make decisions and you've got to join with. So it's a partnership rather than a dictatorship. So in that way, your parents created that space for you to develop that skill. If they hadn't, then you would be in a different place when you then are in a relationship trying to negotiate what needs to be done. You'd be more in the, dictatorship lane rather than democracy, and let's hear the rules, but how are we going to manifest these? How are we going to actually live these out? So I think that most people will be able to come up with examples of where they were in that situation where, I'm not sure, but I think I'm meant to be doing this, but maybe, why am I doing that? And so I've had those discussions with my kids all the time, because I come from a very discussion-oriented background. My parents are both educators. It's from the time we were born, there was always a reason to discuss things, and even punishments had to be negotiated and discussed and, cited with references from the Bible as to why it was wrong. And, there was a lot of that going on. And so it just came naturally to me when I became a parent that I parented more in that way. Like, there are rules. These are the reasons for the rules. These are the sources for the rules. But if you choose not to do it, then what are the repercussions of that? Why did you do it? We're going to have to discuss. You can't just wild out with no responsibility. So that's my perspective, and that's what shaped me. So therefore, that's what I've now shaped my kids for. And so they now are going to continue that. So you see how it goes that way. And I see their relationship with God being very, very much connected to that style. They look at things, they don't just take it on face value. They look at it, they read, they come back, they question, they debate. And then they go along. But in doing so, that strengthens their relationship with God rather than weakens it. So I just think that there are lots of examples of how your parenting and your experiences really frame who you are right now and how you will then parent as well. And all of that goes hand in hand with how you and your children will then understand God and relate to God.
Professor Carole, we only have about 10 minutes of discussion left, but we're definitely getting some really good direction of thinking and some helpful hints about how to reframe our thinking, where to look for understanding. I wonder if you can help us with this. Is it possible to say that there is, from a psychological perspective, a healthy picture of love as it occurs in the family relationship in early stage? And if yes, if no, I'll just withdraw my question. But if yes, can you try to paint some of the aspects of that healthy love?
I think yes. And I think there are many things that contribute to painting a picture of healthy love environments. So I'm going to throw a few ideas out myself, but I believe that everybody on this call will have examples of things that really made them feel loved and expanded their capacity to share love. I think for children growing up in a family, seeing the parents act in loving ways towards each other, really, really helpful. If all they see is parents arguing and fighting and you know, heaven forbid, being aggressive or violent, that is just so damaging, because the marriage relationship is what society holds up as the big love relationship. And if your love relationship is fractured, people are being beaten, people are being abused, shouting at, angry, then, you know, my heart bleeds for a child who grows up in that environment, because what do they have to draw from? It's really a tragedy. So if we can have parents who can actually model loving behavior between each other, kids are always watching. They're like 24-hour surveillance cameras. A little holding somebody's hand or hugging them or saying thank you and being grateful for whatever it is that they're doing and how they're contributing. All of these things are ways to show that you love, and they're ways that you can model, and then people then model that. This idea of gratitude is a big thing. I find that there's not enough time spent being grateful or expressing gratitude in families. And if parents and siblings model that, then their whole perspective on life changes. When you focus on gratitude, it takes your whole focus away from all of the brokenness, hurt, pain, things you don't have, things you wish you had. No, no, no. Just let's work on what we actually have and how grateful we are for that. It changes your whole personality, your whole outlook. You become a glass half full person rather than a glass half empty person. I mean, it's a big thing. And so in psychology, we'll often tell people to start a gratitude journal, please, because you are so focused on these negative aspects of yourself, you're missing all of the blessings that you have in your life. And so sharing gratitude, being kind and loving to people in the family. There's some people who they come from toxic, emotionally toxic backgrounds, and they don't even know how to relate in a positive, healthy environment. So they'll meet you and you will be that positive, healthy environment, and they will create confusion in the situation just so that they are emotionally comfortable. They're in their emotional comfort zone, which is confusion, argument, and, you know, disaster. And you wonder, how did this even happen? We were having a good time, and how did we get to this point where everybody's arguing and fighting? And if you sit down and think about it and you listen, you'll realize that somebody is recreating that drama based on their own, you know, background and experience. He looked at me funny. Why are you looking at me like that? You said this. No, I didn't say that. You meant this. It just comes up. And before you know it, this happy, calm, peaceful environment is now very contentious because somebody just never had that kind of space and they don't know how to exist in that space. So they'll create that. So these are things that we've got to be careful about when we're thinking about creating an environment that will foster children to have healthy relationships. We've got to get these things involved: generosity, kindness, loving, examples, speaking to people kindly. People, what is with the bad speech and the being very mean and negative to people? Sometimes, and as many people know, words can hurt more than actual physical violence, and it stays around much longer. So when people denigrate people and say bad things about them and humiliate them, these things hurt and they stay. They're scars that last well into adulthood and into other relationships. So we don't want to do those. We want to be kind in our words and kind in our communication, supportive and inspiring. So all of these things are things. I mean, I don't know if you've thought of anything that anybody else wants to pop in and say that it's been really helpful to feeling loved and being able to then share love.
I know something that early on helped me feel loved in my family and friend circles was when I was allowed to be part of the conversation. I remember one thing, like my parents, when I had the interest, I was allowed to sit at the table with the grown-ups and participate in the conversation if it was something I was interested in or curious about. Like I remember, I'm a little kid and they'd be maybe something about politics or the news or I don't know. But I'd be a little kid and I'd be like, well, I'm kind of interested in what you guys are saying. And they let me sit there. They didn't say, oh, go play with, like, if I wanted to be there, they let me. And just like the fact that they let me be there indicated to me that I was loved and accepted and wanted, and it stuck with me.
Validated that you matter. Yeah, thank you. Any other examples that people have of things that worked, things that really helped you develop your sense and ability to love?
Yeah, I remember many times my dad would allow me to just talk in the car. And even as I was saying things, I knew that they were off. And part of me was expecting him to come down like, no, that's not right. But he would let me finish my thought. And then sometimes I get into the habit of saying, okay, forget that thing, that was wrong. And then I'd move on and, oh no, this one was right. But I think that idea of him letting me get it, and I suppose it was grace to some extent, because I think if it was me, I would have come down. That was something that always made me felt loved and affirmed.
Yeah, that affirmation is a really big thing. If we can find ways to affirm each other, it then sets up a wellspring in you that you can be loved. It's so sad when people have a violation of attachment and love in childhood, or even later on, but certainly in childhood, that their capacity to trust somebody enough to love them is completely damaged, because trust is foundational to love. And many of these things that we were talking about happening in families, it's a violation of trust. And then once you don't have that trust and you've never been able to develop that trust, then it affects your earthly relationships, but it also affects your relationship with how you understand God to be and how you can trust God to take care of your concerns or not. So yeah, thank you.
I think maybe as a way of concluding the conversation, I would have loved to have more time. It's always too short. It's really always too short. But let's try to share also a takeaway from what Dr. Hunt has shared. What are some of the ways in which maybe your mind was reframed, some new insights you've gained, and how can you apply that in your personal context? Really, that's change begins with us, right?
So one of the takeaway is, like, from the previous session as well, I figure out that the relationship is one of the most important thing, and be cautious and be aware of the new relationship that you are going into. So it's like every moment is a route to a new relationship. And as a Christian, or at least as a person who know a little bit more about love of God, we have to be more cautious about what we know. So we can also be another good start of an influence rather than a harmful one.
Thank you.
So a thought that's been kind of slowly forming in the darkness of my brain through the course of this conversation, especially in the way that Dr. Woolford-Hunt has been talking about, in the clinical setting, the way that, psychologists will model that affirmation and they'll model the good adaptive behavior, but they'll also, provide, affirm the person when the person shows a healthy behavior, and that through that relationship, the person will actually begin to change. Talking about, when as children, when our parents validated us, when our parents included us, when our parents let us talk, all those types of things, how it helped grow us and form us in a place of love. And all of this kind of connecting then with like the Bible and what God says. I'm thinking of like what would be like the biblical jargon that we would attach to this. And I feel like the words forgiveness and reconciliation are coming to my mind, but those are two words that I often think we don't carry much meaning because we've said them so much in religious settings and they don't carry that meaning. But I think that really what God's goal is to do that, to have that healthy relationship with people where he's affirming them and he's validating them and he's welcoming them and he's modeling healthy behaviors for them and engaging in that and slowly helping mold them and change them and bring them into a healthier place. And I'm especially thinking about the fact that oftentimes the biggest way that people will connect with God doing that is when they connect with us doing that. You know, Paul says that God has entrusted to us the ministry of reconciliation. And I feel like that God is just, you know, the best psychologist. And he understands that, quite frankly, people's interactions with us are going to influence their interaction with him. And so since all of us are connected with him, he's like, I need you guys to go out there and love people well and do this reconciliation thing and this forgiveness thing, because that is going to help people connect with me in that way. And so I, for me, my takeaway from this whole night is that I have a part to play in giving people a vision of God that is a reconciling God.
Thank you.
I'd love to piggyback off of that if I can. Um, I think recently I've been reflecting on what does the gospel mean to me, and one of the things I've been coming to as a conclusion is that like the gospel looks like the image of God being restored and reconciled in us through relationships and like healing of brokenness that we experience. And I know that for myself personally, my image of God has definitely changed and shifted and grown and stretched over the even just the past couple years. It's different than it was when I was younger, and I know it's probably going to change more in the future, but I welcome that because I think as it grows, as I grow, my mind grows and it can understand and grasp things that I couldn't before. And I think my takeaway from this talk, this discussion specifically is just how important gratitude is. I think I find myself kind of getting stuck in ruts of like of just negativity, and I know that that will often reflect on how I feel like God looks at me, and if I'm not feeling like I'm being productive or producing enough, then I'll feel like God thinks I'm also doing enough. And so I think what I want to do tonight is I'm going to get out my little journal and I'm going to write down some things that I'm super thankful for that God has been putting in my life that I've just not been paying attention to.
I think on a very like practical level, I think it's always important to look at like the importance of parenting, even potentially on theology. I think that's a huge concept that I probably haven't thought about before. The other one is, as Dr. Woolford-Hunt was discussing how many relationships or relationships in general develop, it just helped me to realize again that God takes time with us. And that's something that I always sometimes don't like. I like it to be like, it's in there, it happened, it changed, and I'm good now. But I think if we were to remove all the questionings, all the conversations, all the examples that God gives in the Bible for that discussion, we would probably have a very thin Bible. And so I think it's just an important idea that that love expresses itself in patience many times. And we need to have that with other people as well.
Thank you. You guys have really summarized some of the main things that we've hit on. And if any of our listeners have any ideas, I'm sure the host would be happy to have it put on the chat, and so we could continue the discussion, because this is an ongoing discussion. But it's been a pleasure to be here and to participate and join in with your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woolford-Hunt. Definitely has been a rich conversation with clear takeaways for us, which means that we've understood some of the concepts and the discussion, and we can go home with something new, something fresh, and a task, if you want. I think for me, the concept that stood out most in the conversation was the unknown. That when we have to detach from harmful patterns, it's oftentimes difficult because we are not comfortable with the unknown. And my personal journey has been a journey into the unknown with God, and I've experienced God in the closest aspects in that unknown. but that is because I formed a relationship of trust with him. And I see people around me struggle with taking that step into the unknown. And I think I would just say, just as a way of encouragement for those of us who have more of a hard time giving things up, giving up control and stepping into the unknown, that God is already there. God is already there. He's ahead of us. We're not stepping into the unknown ever without God meeting us there, being before us. And so it's a journey of change and transformation that is uncomfortable, but it's worth it. It's worth taking this journey with God to learn better patterns, healthier patterns of relationships and of love. And I think as we continue this conversation in the future episodes, we're going to specifically focus on how the Bible portrays God as love. And that's going to help us very much reframe our thinking, correct some of the erroneous maybe understandings of God that we have. In the next 6 episodes, we're going to be doing just that, focusing on the Old Testament first in a couple episodes, and then looking into the New Testament, and then providing a systematic perspective on the Bible, really zooming in on how God's actions, words, interactions with people, relationships, how the events that we are derived from God, how do these portray him as love? And in the process, I'm sure we're going to also have to tackle some of the paradoxes, some of the challenges to God as love, because that's some of the biggest questions people have about God is, well, how can he be love if he does this or that, if he wants people to do this or that in the Bible, right? So we'll try to untangle some of those questions as well in the next few episodes. Our next guest on Thursday will be Dr. Rahel Wells, going into some study of the Old Testament. So we really look forward to that. But for now, just another big thank you for Dr. Woolford-Hunt for thank you first of all for taking the time for us, because I know every day is long for you, and today especially was back-to-back classes and meetings and things like that. We appreciate you being with us in this time frame. We're taking away a lot, and I believe that God will bless and multiply what we have learned, and we'll keep bringing to our mind as we go along the things that we've learned, and learn how to also teach us how to incorporate that in our daily life, really. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
And thank you also for participants tonight, Kyun, Ruth, Mark, and Nicola. Great discussion, great questions, great comments. I appreciate your openness and your feedback, and always moving more in depth with the conversation. To those of us who have been watching live, we appreciate your time. We are thankful for you. We do not take it for granted. I know there's so many more things you could have done in this hour. And if you have chosen to spend it with us and learn with us, we appreciate that. And we hope to see you next time. Until then, stay blessed and stay safe.